Imagine being trapped in a place you know too well but can't escape. That's the life of Howard Radley. Locked inside his apartment, he has no way out and no one to turn to. Day and night, all he hears is the steady drip of water, driving him to the edge. It's not rain, it couldn't be. Howard's apartment sits in the middle of the building, far from the outside walls. Still, the sound continues, endlessly echoing through the empty rooms. It feels like the world outside has forgotten him, leaving him alone with that maddening drip. The days blur together, and the water keeps falling, drop by drop. Howard has tried to find where it's coming from, but nothing makes sense. The ceiling near the wood stove, something he never uses, has become dark and rotten. The spot is filled with mold, spreading like a disease. It's a mess, but Howard doesn't care. Fixing it is the landlord's job whenever he decides to show up again. For now, the noise is his biggest enemy, filling every moment with dread. Each drip feels like a reminder of how things are falling apart, not just in the apartment, but inside Howard too. Howard isn't a neighbor anyone would miss. His apartment is in complete disrepair, holes in the walls, piles of junk everywhere, and creatures scurrying around in the dark corners. But for Howard, these things aren't just mess, they are his comfort. The clutter gives him a strange sense of safety, like walls protecting him from the outside world. He surrounds himself with old clothes he'll never wear, toys meant for children, and books he'll never open. None of it makes sense to keep, but it helps calm his mind. The chaos around him matches the chaos inside him. But there's no comfort in that awful dripping sound. It crawls under his skin, keeping him awake at night. He lies there in the dark, with pillows pressed over his ears and blankets wrapped tight around him. He plays old cassette tapes, hoping the music will drown out the noise. But nothing works. The drip never stops. It seeps into every part of his life, pulling him deeper into frustration and fear. And the worst part is Howard knows this is just the beginning. The dripping doesn't just stay a sound, it begins to leave its mark. Over time, the ceiling becomes soft and swollen, sagging under the constant flow of water. Howard watches helplessly as the spot grows darker, spreading like an infection. Cracks creep along the edges, and the once small leak transforms into a slow, steady destruction. The ceiling isn't just breaking, it's giving up. Every day, more mold creeps through the walls, filling the air with a damp, rotting smell. Howard's apartment becomes a place of ruin. There's no space left untouched by decay. His walls, already covered in holes and grime, now crumble under the weight of neglect. The water stains blend with layers of dirt and mold, turning everything black and green. Howard no longer has the energy to fight back. His attempts to manage the mess are half-hearted. He throws old pots and pans under the leaks, hoping to catch the water, but it's never enough. The sound echoes louder, bouncing off the clutter that fills every corner of his home. The junk Howard hoards piles higher, making it harder to move around. Garbage bags and old boxes block the doorways, turning his apartment into a maze. He doesn't care anymore. He doesn't even know where the front door is buried under all the clutter. The objects that once gave him comfort now close in on him, making the space feel smaller every day. He even wonders about the cats he used to have. He hasn't seen them in weeks, lost somewhere in the chaos. The thought bothers him briefly, but it quickly slips away, just like everything else in his crumbling world. Howard's apartment becomes a place where nothing works. His electricity has been shut off, and the darkness feels like another weight pressing down on him. At night, the only light comes from the window, a faint glow that sneaks through the thick bars he nailed over it. Even his water, when it trickles from the rusty taps, is murky and brown. Howard drinks it without caring. He stopped worrying about the small things, as every new day brings a deeper kind of hopelessness. It's not just the apartment that's falling apart. Howard feels it too. The drip reminds him with every drop that things are only getting worse. And the worst part, he knows the ceiling won't hold much longer. One way or another, everything will come crashing down, and when it does, there will be no way to stop it. Howard's life has become a strange mix of survival and surrender. He no longer tries to fix anything. He just lets it be broken, moldy, or rotting. His thoughts have settled into the same decay that surrounds him. There's no urgency left in him, no desire to escape. Leaving the apartment feels impossible, so he prepares to never leave. He stockpiles dehydrated food, stuffing it into boxes and bags. It's bland and foul tasting, but Howard eats it without a second thought. For him, it's just fuel to keep going in a world where each day feels heavier than the last. He's built his life around avoiding anything that might disturb the fragile bubble of his existence. The outside world feels like a threat, and he does everything he can to shut it out. His routines are built on old habits and fears. He avoids electricity entirely, convinced it carries invisible dangers, chemicals, or currents that could harm him in ways he doesn't understand. In his mind, staying disconnected is the only way to stay safe. The dim light from the window is the only illumination he allows, and when night falls, the pitch-black darkness settles over him like a familiar blanket. Howard's fears go beyond the ordinary. They have sunk deep into his bones, shaping the way he moves through life. He refuses to use most of the appliances he's collected, afraid they might spark a fire. Even though his apartment is filled with flammable junk, he can't bear the thought of things burning. Fire isn't just a danger, it's a nightmare that lives in his mind. So, he surrounds himself with items that never serve a purpose. They're just there, gathering dust, cluttering his space, and feeding his need for control in a life that feels so out of control. But even control has its limits. Howard's paranoia runs so deep that he's sealed every possible way out. He nailed the windows shut, blocked the doors with heavy piles of garbage, and covered every gap with more clutter. He doesn't want to be tempted to leave or worse, let something in. Somewhere deep under the mess, he has hidden two things, a fire axe and an old revolver, both tucked under his mattress like sacred talismans. They are the last reminders of his father's old advice to keep weapons close to ward off nightmares. Howard isn't sure if the nightmares are real or in his head anymore, but he keeps the weapons just the same. They are a strange kind of comfort, a reminder that in his collapsing world, he can still cling to some shred of control. Howard lives each day in the same uneasy rhythm, trapped between fear and resignation. The world outside feels distant, but it still teases him through the small window above his bed. He stares out for hours, watching people pass by, wishing he could be part of their lives. But the fear keeps him rooted where he is, behind walls of junk and silence. His mind drifts between thoughts of what could have been and the harsh reality he's created for himself. Each day feels heavier than the last, and the noise of the dripping water is always there, a relentless reminder that things will only keep getting worse. The dripping starts as a small nuisance, but over time it grows louder, sharper, and harder to ignore. The sound no longer comes from just one spot. New leaks appear like wounds opening across the ceiling. It's not a slow trickle anymore. Now, multiple streams of water splatter onto the floor, creating uneven rhythms that twist Howard's nerves tighter with every drop. The leaks spread like a plague, their chaotic patterns drumming against his sanity. Even the pots, Pans and bowls he once placed to catch the water can't keep up. The water pools on the hardwood, creeping into every crack. Then, one day, a large section of the ceiling caves in. With a crash that shakes the apartment, pieces of plaster and wood slam into the mess below. Dust clouds the room, and for a moment, Howard stands still, frozen by the sound that feels like a gunshot in the silence. He gathers the fallen debris into another plastic bag, tossing it carelessly into the pile of junk that has swallowed the rest of his life. But things are far from over. The collapse marks the beginning of something worse. More leaks follow the first, each one bringing fresh water and more destruction. The ceiling begins to disintegrate faster than Howard can handle. Soon, it's not just drops anymore, streams of water pour from above, drenching the floor, soaking his clutter, and turning the apartment into a soggy ruin. The smell of mold grows thicker, sticking to everything it touches. Wet cardboard collapses under its own weight, and the garbage bags burst open, releasing their rotten contents. His once cluttered sanctuary now feels more like a drowning cell. Howard no longer sleeps, at least, not in the way most people do. The nights stretch on endlessly, filled with the maddening sound of water splashing into his mess. His pillows are useless, and no amount of cassette tapes can block out the chaos. Even the rats scurrying through the junk seem unsettled. They dart in and out of hiding, disturbed by the changes in their territory. As if sensing the shift, they become louder, squeaking and scrambling, desperate to escape a sinking ship. Howard knows, deep down, that his apartment is falling apart. The water is relentless, eating away at the walls, the ceiling, and everything he owns. He feels the air growing heavier, damp with moisture and thick with the scent of decay. Each day, the space around him becomes smaller, tighter, more suffocating. The place he once thought of as his refuge now feels like a trap, closing in on him inch by inch. And still, the water keeps coming. Howard is trapped, not just by the walls of his apartment, but by the slow, inevitable collapse of everything around him. One morning, Howard wakes to find that the ceiling has finally given way. A massive chunk crashes down, taking part of the floor above with it. Dust and broken plaster rain down, and through the gaping hole, Howard stares into the room above his. It's eerily silent, more decayed than his own apartment. Pieces of crumbled walls hang loose, and the wooden beams are warped with water damage. Sunlight filters in through cracks, casting strange, jagged shadows across the space. It looks like no one has been there for years, abandoned to rot just like everything else in the building. Howard knows he has no choice now. If he stays below, the rest of his apartment might collapse on top of him. He gathers the few things he can find, the axe and the revolver, from under his mattress and straps them to himself. His hands shake, but he pushes down the fear gnawing at him. The idea of leaving his space fills him with dread, but there's no alternative. The air in the apartment feels thick, almost toxic, like it's closing in on him. He knows that if he stays, he will not survive. Climbing up through the hole is harder than he expected. The clutter in his room is soaked and rotten, making it difficult to find stable footing. Moldy bags burst under his weight, and the slimy cardboard slips under his hands. The damp, decaying smell clings to him as he struggles upward. The edges of the hole burn his palms like acid, leaving red welts behind. Rats squeal around him, their frantic movements unsettling. They scramble up and out of the apartment, fleeing as if they know something Howard doesn't. Finally, Howard pulls himself through the broken ceiling into the room above. It's worse than he imagined, more than just abandoned. The room feels lifeless, as if it's been drained of everything human. The walls are covered with thick layers of black mold, and puddles of stagnant water fill the corners. What's left of the furniture is warped and crumbling, and insulation spills out from torn sections of the walls. Every surface looks sickly, as if touched by decay and left to fester. Howard surveys the space, feeling the weight of silence pressing down on him. The air is colder here, damp and stale, thick with the stench of rotting wood and mildew. With every step, the floor shifts beneath him, creaking ominously. Large cracks run through the walls, as if the building itself is on the verge of collapse. Howard grips his axe tightly, knowing that what lies beyond this room could be even worse than what he's left behind. But there's no going back now. He has to move forward deeper into the decaying ruins of the building above. As Howard moves deeper into the decayed upper levels, he realizes the building is not entirely empty. At first, he notices shadows shifting along the edges of the crumbling walls, quick flashes of movement that vanish the moment he looks. Then, he hears them, scuttling noises, low squeals, and the wet slither of something dragging itself across the floor. He knows the rats from his apartment, but these creatures are different. They are larger, bloated, and twisted in ways that make them almost unrecognizable. The first one crawls out of a cracked wall, its long limbs bending unnaturally. Its body is swollen, patches of mold growing from its fur. Where its eyes should be are bulging green boils, glowing faintly in the dim light. Howard grips his axe tighter as more of these creatures appear, creeping from the shadows. They don't seem afraid of him. Instead, they move with strange indifference, dragging their bloated bodies across the floor as if they belong to the decay surrounding them. As he walks further, Howard encounters other creatures, ones he can't name. Giant slugs the size of rats inch across the walls, their bodies slick with slime and covered in jagged bobs. They feed on the thick mold growing everywhere, leaving trails of mucus behind them. Howard watches with a mix of disgust and fascination as these mold slugs burrow into the soft, rotting wood, disappearing into the walls only to re-emerge seconds later in other places. But the worst are the things that shouldn't exist at all. From piles of mold and debris rise shapes that pulse like organs, wet, breathing masses that seem alive. As Howard steps closer, he notices faint outlines of faces forming within the fungus, twisted and distorted like nightmares brought to life. The sight makes his skin crawl. These fungal creatures seem half-formed, caught between being alive and something far worse. The air feels heavier here, thick with moisture and the sharp, earthy scent of mold spores floating in the air. Howard tries to move quietly, hoping to avoid attracting attention, but every step he takes echoes in the hollow space. The creatures pay him little mind, more interested in their decayed surroundings than in him. Yet their presence weighs on Howard like a growing fear, a fear that something much worse is waiting deeper within the building. He presses forward, heart racing, his axe ready in his hands. He knows that these creatures, however horrifying, are only a glimpse of what's to come. Howard forces himself to keep moving, even though each step feels heavier than the last. The building stretches out before him like a decaying labyrinth, each hallway more ruined than the one before. Walls have crumbled into heaps of debris, and entire sections of the floor are missing, revealing jagged holes that drop into the dark void below. Howard navigates the ruins carefully, testing each step, knowing that one wrong move could send him plunging into the depths. The air reeks of rot and mold, thick with the sour stench of stagnant water and decayed wood. The deeper Howard ventures, the more the building feels like a place that no longer belongs to the human world. Huge gaps in the walls expose neighboring rooms, each one more defiled by water and decay. The ceilings sag, streaked with green mold that pulses like a living thing. The black fungus spreads across every surface, growing over furniture, doorways, and walls, swallowing them whole. Howard steps cautiously around the twisted remains of things that might have once been familiar: a lamp overtaken by fungus, a couch consumed by rot, and cracked picture frames coated in green spores. In some places, rubble has piled so high that entire doorways are blocked. Howard swings his axe, hacking at the debris until he clears a path. His muscles ache, and his breath comes in short gasps, but he pushes forward. The deeper he goes, the more unnatural the air feels. It's humid, yet cold, with an oppressive weight that seems to press down on his chest. Strange noises echo through the hall's wet sounds, distant scratching, and the occasional skittering of unseen things. Howard knows he's not alone, but whatever else is here seems content to lurk just out of sight, waiting. As he explores further, he stumbles across areas where the mold has taken on grotesque new forms. Huge cysts bulge from the walls, glistening with moisture. Some pulse faintly, as though something alive is trapped inside, while others lie deflated, leaking a sickly green fluid. Howard doesn't dare touch them. In other places, nests made of rotting debris and viscera cling to the corners, webbed together with a strange white substance that resembles both silk and flesh. The sight turns his stomach, but he forces himself to keep going. There's no turning back now. The hallways seem to shift as Howard moves through them, as though the building itself is alive and trying to trap him. Paths that once seemed clear twist into dead ends, and the walls close in like the teeth of a trap. His boots splash through puddles of slimy water, and the sound reverberates eerily in the silence. Every now and then, he hears the creatures scratching, slithering, or clicking deep within the walls. But none of them emerge. It feels as if they are waiting for something, biding their time. Howard's axe becomes his lifeline, cutting through obstacles that block his way. He hacks through rotted doors and tears down barricades of broken furniture. Each swing drains more of his strength, but he doesn't stop. Somewhere in this forsaken place lies the way out, or at least the end of whatever nightmare he's trapped in. The deeper he goes, the more the building transforms into something alien, something beyond the decay of time. And all the while, the mold spreads, creeping along the edges of his vision, as if determined to swallow him whole before he can escape. At last, Howard reaches the end of the hallway, where a massive door looms before him. It's unlike anything he's seen so far, completely overtaken by black mold, with large boils that swell and pulse as though alive. Thick, slimy webbing clings to its surface, stretching like veins across every inch. As he steps closer, something shifts in the walls. Dozens of fleshy, spider-like creatures crawl out from cracks, their legs slick with mucus and their bodies pulsating with strange growths. They scurry away into the shadows, as if fleeing from something far worse beyond the door. Howard tightens his grip on the axe, knowing he has no other choice. With every swing, the mold-covered door splinters, bursting open with a sound like a wet, sickening tear. What lies beyond stops him in his tracks. The hallway is gone, swallowed whole by an enormous mass of mold and organic matter, twisted into grotesque shapes. The walls pulse with life, shifting and writhing as if breathing. The mold isn't just a growth, it's a creature, a living entity consuming everything in its path. Within the heart of the infection, Howard sees figures moving slowly, almost as if in worship. These are no longer creatures. They are the blackened humanoid forms that grew inside the egg sacs he saw earlier. Their bodies are grotesque, with boils where their eyes should be, tendrils sprouting from their skin, and limbs twisting at unnatural angles. Some shamble awkwardly, dragging what remains of their legs behind them, while others twitch and convulse as if barely alive. They gather around a massive, pulsing altar made entirely of black mold and organic webbing, chanting in low, guttural hums that make Howard's skin crawl. On the altar lies something that defies comprehension. A massive, writhing mass of flesh and tendrils, with no face or recognizable form. Dozens of polyps sprout from its body, their mouths opening and closing soundlessly. The thing moves slowly, each tendril curling and twitching as though searching for prey. Howard can feel its presence like a weight pressing down on his mind. Though it has no eyes, it seems to be aware of him, as if it can see into his very soul. Panic surges through him, and without thinking, Howard pulls the revolver from his belt. He fires wildly into the crowd of creatures, hoping to scatter them. The gunshots echo through the mold-infested chamber, but the creatures don't flinch. Instead, they rise slowly, their twisted forms shambling toward him with unnatural movements. Howard tosses the empty gun aside and swings his axe in desperation, but the creatures are too many. One of them grabs the weapon and wrenches it from his hands with terrifying strength. Before Howard can react, tendrils lash out from the darkness, wrapping around his arms and legs. He struggles, but the creatures overwhelm him, dragging him toward one of the massive egg sacs. He thrashes and screams, but it's no use. The sac splits open, releasing a torrent of green, acidic slime that burns his skin. The creatures force him inside, their cold, mold-covered hands pressing him into the thick, gooey mass. The slime fills his mouth and nose, choking him, and the world around him fades into a sickly green haze. As the sac seals shut, Howard feels his body begin to change. The mold creeps over his skin, spreading like fire, seeping into his veins and twisting his flesh into something inhuman. His mind slips away, lost in the hive consciousness that binds the creatures to the monstrous thing they worship. His last thought, before everything goes dark, is the sound that haunted him from the beginning, an endless, relentless drip, still echoing through the decay. And then there is only silence.